What's going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, Magnus Carlsen is facing off against Fabiano Caruana and his ultra-aggressive Kingside attack in the 2023 CCT Finals. Now, in the game, Fabiano Caruana is playing as white. He opens 1e4, best by test, and Magnus goes 1c5, the Sicilian Defense. Now we have knight to f3 for Fabiano and e6 for Magnus, a very interesting choice. He's not going for his typical Sveshnikov variation with the move knight to c6. Now here Fabiano, he does break in the center, d4 on the board. We have the open Sicilian. Now Magnus takes, Fabiano takes back with the knight. And here we are going to see what Magnus Carlsen has in mind for this game. And here in this position, he does play the move 4, a6, heading for the Khan variation of the Sicilian Defense. Now the Khan is very flexible, and Magnus does like to play from time to time. However, it does give white the center and freedom to do pretty much whatever he wants in the position. Now here, Fabiano, he plays the line starting with the move knight to c3. An interesting choice, not going for the main line, starting with either c4 or bishop d3. So now, after knight to c3, the option of playing the Maroczy Bind with the move c4 at some point is gone. But on the other hand, you do get very fast development of your pieces, and you can castle on the king side or the queen side. So overall, it is a very flexible choice against Magnus Carlsen's Khan Sicilian. Now here, Magnus, the main line is going to be b5, expanding on the queen side, but instead he goes queen c7, staying very flexible with the setup. He may go b5 in the future, or he may not, depending what Fabiano does. Now here, Fabiano, bishop d3, that is the main idea in this position. Now you are ready to castle on the king side, or again, you can go, say, queen to e2, bishop e3, and castle long on the queen side. We'll have to wait and see what Fabiano wants to do in the game. Now here, Magnus, knight to f6 on the board, a very standard idea. And Fabiano, queen to e2, a very aggressive setup with the queen and the bishop. And of course, he did not castle on the king side on that move. And that may be signaling he wants to go castling on the queen side here. Now, in this position for Magnus Carlsen, it is very important to find the best defensive setup against Fabiano Caruana's aggressive placement of his pieces. Now, the best ideas will include bishop d6 and bishop b4, trying to stay very active with a dark squared bishop. However, instead of that, here Magnus Carlsen, he actually locks in his bishop on the f8 square, and he goes d6. Now, bishop d6 and bishop b4 are no longer possibilities. Magnus is heading for a Scheveningen-style pawn structure in the middle of the board. However, here, Fabiano Caruana, his pieces are perfectly placed to fight against the Scheveningen, and he's going to have a wide variety of attacking ideas here, especially including ideas like f4 and g4 expanding on the king side. Now here in this position, g4 right away is playable, but instead Fabiano, he goes f4, expanding in the center with the f-pawn, and now e5 is a very real threat. What is Magnus going to do about it? Well, in the game, he simply goes knight b d7. The idea being if Fabiano goes e5, that will now lose a pawn, as d takes and then knight takes does win the pawn. So very solid idea. However, Fabiano, he is sticking to his guns, and here he goes all out on the king side by advancing the g-pawn 2 squares forward. Yes, the move in this position is g4, and here the threat is going to be g5, and believe it or not, the only square for the knight in this position will be g8, and that will be an absolute strategic disaster for Magnus. So Magnus, what is he going to do about the threat of g5 from Fabiano Caruana? Well, it turns out he has a few different playable ideas. For example, h6 trying to clamp down on the g5 square is playable. You can also go g6. That way, if Fabiano does go g5, you have the h5 square you can go to with the knight, and that knight will be covered by the g-pawn. However, instead of those ideas, here Magnus, he finds the strongest idea. That is simply knight to c5, jumping in with the knight to the c5 square, and the beauty of this move is it does vacate the d7 square. That way now, in response to g5, Magnus can go knight f d7, and the knights will still be on good squares. And that is what happens here in this game. So, Fabiano Caruana, g5 on the board, expanding on the king side. That is the main idea of his setup. And now here, Magnus, knight f d7, and again, the knights are on good squares. He does not have coordination problems yet in the game. Now, Fabiano Caruana, here in this position, how does he want to continue the attack? Well, first of all, you do not want to go short castles on the king side. That move would not synergize with the ideas like f4 and g4 to g5. Instead, there are a few good playable options. First of all, you can go h4, threatening h5 and g6 right away. And beyond that, you can also go a3 or bishop e3, intending a very fast long castles. However, instead of that, Fabiano finds a very strong idea that absolutely surprised me when I first saw it. He actually expanded on the queen side with the move a4, pushing that a-pawn 2 squares forward instead of just 1. Now, the benefit of this move is you do stop b5 advances from black. that would obviously lose a pawn on the spot, as first of all, that b5 square is being covered by the knights and the bishop, and beyond that, that a pawn would be pinned to the rook on the a8 square. After b5, a takes b5, a takes b5 back is not possible, as that loses the rook on a8. However, the drawback of this move, first of all, you do weaken the b4 square, and beyond that, you do make the idea of castling long in the future that much less attractive, as the pawn is a big weakness on the queen side now. So very interesting idea by Fabiano. I was surprised by it, but it turns out it is very strong in this position. All right, here, Magnus, right now, he goes bishop e7, intending potentially short castles on the king side, a very flexible idea, but Fabiano Caruana, he is sticking to his guns. He goes h4, expanding on the king side, and now, of course, the threat is going to be h5 and potentially g6 next, trying to blow open the king side. All right, now, Magnus Carlsen, the greatest chess player of all time. How does he want to deal with these threats on the king side? In the game, he just goes b6, a very simple move, intending bishop b7 and maybe rook c8 or maybe even long castles, depending on how the game develops. Now here, Fabiano, he's not quite ready to go h5 and g6. Instead, he goes bishop e3, a very solid idea. Now castling long on the queen side is an option on any move. Now Magnus bishop b7, and then h5 on the board for Fabiano. Now the threat is g6. And what is Magnus going to do about it? Well, in the game, he actually ignores the threat. He just goes rook c8. So a very simple move. Obviously, he is giving up the option of long castles. However, now the queen and the rook on c8 and c7 put a lot of pressure on the c-file. Now, real fast, Fabiano, is he finally ready to play g6? Well, it turns out the answer is no. If you go g6 and then black takes on g6, then you cannot go h takes g6 back, as the rook on the h1 square would be hanging. So before you go g6, you have to defend that rook somehow. There are a few different ways you can do that. You can move the queen and defend the rook. You can go, say, rook h2, and you could also go long castles. However, in the game, Fabiano finds perhaps the strongest idea, simply rook g1, getting the rook off the open h-file, or the soon-to-be open h-file, and not having to go long castles prematurely, and now the rook is defended on g1, and g6 is a real threat. Now here, Magnus, he does not like the idea of g6. He does not want his king side being opened up. So with that in mind, he goes g6, trying to block the idea of g6 from Fabiano. But here, Fabiano Caruana, he is ready for the idea of g6, and he simply slides his rook back to the h1 square, back to where it came from. So Fabiano going rook g1, then back to the h1 square, and the benefit of this being he forced out the weakening move g6 from Magnus. And now the threat is h takes g6, and if Magnus takes on h5, then rook takes h5 would be a very strong idea, and the rook would be very active on the h-file. So now here, Magnus, how is he going to stop these threats on the king side? Well, he is ready for them, and he busts out the strongest idea here, breaking in the center with a very strong idea, e5. So bang, e5 on the board, and whenever you play these Scheveningen style structures, you always have to be ready as white or as black for breaks like d5 and e5, and you always have to calculate when they're good and when they're not good. And here it is definitely the right move, so e5 on the board. Now the threat, of course, is e takes d4. White is going to have to do something about that threat on the knight. Where is the knight going to go? Well, it turns out both knight b3 and knight f3 are very playable here, but instead, Fabiano Caruana, he actually ignores the threat on the knight, and he simply takes on g6. So h takes g6 on the board, and what is the idea? Well, it turns out if you take the knight on d4 right away, e takes d4 as Magnus Carlsen, that would be an absolutely massive mistake. Then you just reply bishop takes d4, and between the bishop and the rook lining up on that diagonal and this file right here, the h file, the threats are just overwhelming. So e takes d4 is not a good idea. Magnus cannot play that in this position. And beyond that, of course, h takes g6, not a good idea. You drop the rook on h8. So with that in mind, here the move for Magnus, he just maintains the tension in the center, and he just goes f takes g6, the strongest idea. And now, once again, that threat on the knight is real. You have to do something about that knight on d4. Or do you? Well, it turns out there is a brilliant move you can play in this position where you simply leave the knight hanging on d4. And yes, of course, the idea is going to be f5. That would be an absolutely brilliant move, but the complications there are just mind-blowing. Fabiano did not play it in the game. Instead, the move he did play was knight to f3, but this turns out to be quite a bit weaker. And here, Magnus Carlsen, he starts to slowly take over in the game. He takes on f4, e takes f4, the bishop takes back, then Magnus jumps in with the knight. Knight takes d3 on the board, then we have c takes, and here Magnus has a variety of very good ideas. For example, surprisingly, short castling on the king side is actually a very good move, but instead he just jumps in with the knight to the e5 square, knight to e5 on the board, and now despite not being the best idea, that knight is very well placed on e5, and of course does pressure that pawn on d3 and the knight on the f3 square. Alright, Fabiano, he is not done attacking. Here in this position, he does not take on e5 with the bishop or the knight. Instead, he just drops his bishop back to the e3 square, bishop to e3 on the board, and the idea is that bishop on e3 does put pressure on that pawn on b6, and it does make it a little bit easier to get activity going on the f-file with, say, rook to f1 in the future. Now here, Magnus, he does castle in this position, short castles on the board, and Fabiano Caruana, the strongest idea would be knight takes e5, trying to transform the pawn structure in the center. Instead, he goes knight d4, a relatively active move, and he is threatening knight to e6, and that would forward both the rook and the queen on the c7 square. So here, Magnus, he has to respond to the threat. In the game, he goes queen d7. Of course, that bishop on e3 no longer attacking the pawn on b6, therefore the queen does not have to defend it right now. So queen d7 on the board for Magnus. Now here in this position, what the heck should Fabiano be doing about his king? He has to do something about it. You can't just leave the king on e1 the rest of the game. First of all, the king would be simply unsafe there, and beyond that, that rook on the a1 square would be stuck out of the game forever. Now here in this position, there is a brilliant move that Fabiano can play to solve the issue of his king, and it's a move that Magnus Carlsen would play in a heartbeat. That move is actually king d2, the bomb cloud style move, artificially castling your king in the middle of the board, whatever you want to call it. And from there, the rook on the queen side is free to enter the game on the f-file, on the g-file, wherever it wants to go. Now, instead of that here, Fabiano Caruana, he does play long castles, and this move turns out to be quite a bit weaker, as Magnus Carlsen can start an attack on the queen side immediately with a very strong pawn sacrifice, and he does find a move. Here, Magnus, b5 is the move, expanding on the queen side, threatening b4, and of course it is a pawn sacrifice. Here, Fabiano can take on b5 twice with the a pawn, then with one of the knights, the c knight or the d knight. The d knight, as the c knight is currently pinned to the king. However, that would not be a good idea. That would open up the a file, and overall Magnus would get a vicious attack. So instead, Fabiano takes on b5 once, a takes b5, then a takes b5, and here he just gets his king off the open c file. King to c1 on the board, a good move, but Magnus Carlsen is not done. He goes b4, further expanding on the queen side, trying to drive back the knight to a weak square. Now, where is the knight supposed to go? You can go to d5. However, the problem with that, after bishop takes d5, then e takes, suddenly the queen has access to the a file on a4 or a7, and white's king is being attacked. That is overall no good. So instead, knight to a2 on the board for Fabiano, a good idea. However, the knight is very passive on the a2 square, and overall, Fabiano is starting to experience problems on the queen side. All right, here, Magnus Carlsen, he finds the best way to increase the pressure. d5 on the board, the idea being if you take the pawn on d5, then bishop takes d5, wins it back, and then you have pressure on that knight on a2, and again, overall, all of Magnus Carlsen's pieces would be entering into the game. Queen to a4 would be coming, rook a8 would be coming soon, and overall, that would be a nightmare on the queen side. So here in this position, Fabiano Caruana, he does not play e takes d5. Instead, he finds an absolutely brilliant idea, and I am not exaggerating here, Chess YouTube. If you like tactical puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the beautiful shot by Fabiano in this position. And while you're at it, go ahead and smash that like button. Thank you so much for doing that. Helps me out so much. All right, here, Fabiano, in this position, he actually sacrifices the rook on the h7 square. So the move is rook takes h7, and this is about as close as you get to a clean sacrifice of the rook. He's giving up the rook for a single pawn, and the idea being he wants to get an attack going against the black king as quickly as possible, and this is about the only way to do it, and it is the strongest move in this position. So now, king takes h7, he is forced. If you don't take the rook, then rook to h1 or queen to h2 is coming, and that will be devastating. So, king takes h7 on the board. Then Fabiano, queen to h2, continuing the attack. The king is under check. The king has to move. King g8 on the board. But then Fabiano, rook to h1. The threat now is queen to h7, and that will be checkmate on the spot. The king has nowhere to go. All right, how does Magnus deal with the threat? In the game, it goes bishop d6, opening up the queen's access to the h7 square, and therefore queen to h7 is no longer a big threat. But of course here, Fabiano, he is not done attacking, and he has more dangerous ideas in this position. Now, one dangerous idea the engine finds is the immediate knight to e6, putting pressure on the rook, and of course the knight cannot be taken. Queen takes e6 would be a blunder, as queen to h7 would be checkmate on the spot. So overall, knight to e6 is just one of the very dangerous resources Fabiano has in this position. Instead of that, he goes bishop f4 here. Part of the idea being you want to block that attack of the bishop on the queen on h2. That x-ray attack is very dangerous, but beyond that, bishop takes e5 is now a real threat from Fabiano. So how does Magnus deal with the threat? Well, there are a few different good moves here. For example, d takes e4 is great, bishop to a6 is excellent, threatening bishop takes d3 with a gain of tempo on the king. However, here, Magnus, he plays a big blunder. He plays the move queen to g7. Now, this move does defend that knight on e5. However, it turns out you had to give it up and you had to go for counterplay immediately. Now here, Fabiano Caruana, he finds the very simple idea of knight to e6, hitting both the rook on f8 and the queen on g7. And what is Magnus going to do about it? Well, in the game, he does not move the queen again. Instead, he jumps in with his own knight to f3 on the board, hitting the queen of Fabiano Caruana. Now, in this position, both the queens, the queen on g7 of Magnus and the queen on h2 of Fabiano, are under attack. What the heck should Fabiano be doing here? Well, the best move is queen to h3. You have to keep the queens on the board to keep the attack going. But instead, Fabiano, he goes knight takes g7, and this turns out to be a very critical mistake. Here, Magnus, of course, he takes the queen on h2, knight takes h2 on the board, and now Fabiano, bishop takes d6 is the move. Now we have two knights that are still hanging. What is Magnus going to do? Well, he does not take on g7. He does not move the knight on h2. Instead, he flies in with the rook to f1 on the board, and here the tactics are just insane. Of course, the rook on h1 is hanging. You have to play rook takes f1. There's nothing else. So, rook takes f1 on the board. Then we have knight takes, and then here, bishop takes b4 for Fabiano. He does not move the knight. The knight is going to be lost no matter what. The only good square is knight to e6, but that simply would not work out in the game for tactical reasons. So now here, king takes g7 on the board. Then we have bishop c3 for Fabiano, hitting the king with check. King to f7, then knight to b4, jumping forward with the knight. And of course here, in this position, remember, Fabiano literally sacrificed that rook on h7 to get the attack going. And as soon as the queens came off the board, Magnus is left with an extra rook. Now granted, Fabiano has two extra pawns in the center and the queen side, but that is just not enough if Magnus Carlsen plays accurately here. And he does. D takes e4 on the board, then d takes, and then bishop takes, winning back one of the pawns. Now Magnus has a full rook for a pawn. It is not looking good for Fabiano. So now king to a2 on the board. And after knight to e3 from Magnus Carlsen, here in this position on move 39, Fabiano Caruana resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen. He just cannot compete in the endgame, being down a full rook. Although rook takes h7 was the right idea earlier in the game, he just didn't follow it up effectively enough to keep the game going. So wow, what a game by Magnus Carlsen and Fabiano Caruana in the CCT Finals of 2023. Alright, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that like button and check out this video right here, featuring yet another crazy game played between Magnus Carlsen and Fabiano Caruana. If you enjoyed this one, I think you'll like that one at least as much, maybe even more than this one, so check it out. And I'll see you in the next video.